Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm John Miller, and this is How the Hell Did We Get Here? A U.S. history podcast. In the last episode, I spent a bunch of time talking about the religious beliefs of some of the most prominent founding fathers. And in particular, I drew kind of a contrast between the more deist, Unitarian set of beliefs that some of the founding fathers had and the more traditional Orthodox Christian beliefs that some of the other founding fathers had. And I talked about the ways in which their various beliefs influenced how they conceived of the American government. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the Washington administration, as well as the first Congress, and I'm going to get into some of the challenges that the United States still faced, despite having a new government that was much stronger, much more centralized, and one that a lot of the more prominent founding fathers fought for because they thought it would help to address some of the problems that the United States was dealing with in the 1780s. This is going to be the first part of a few episodes that I'm going to do on the Washington administration and the first Congresses, and I'm going to talk about the judiciary a little bit. I'm also going to talk about the relationship between Americans, the American government, and Native Americans, how that developed, evolved, progressed, in some cases regressed pretty substantially. And I'm also going to discuss the ways in which the government was formed after the Constitution and how the examples set by the first Congresses, by the Washington administration, by the judiciary, sorted out some of the things that were not explicitly addressed in the Constitution. Because if you look at the Constitution, as I've said in the past, it's not a very long document. There's a lot that isn't there. And if you look at our federal government today in 2024, it's a whole lot bigger than you would conceive of just by having read the Constitution. There's a lot of stuff that the federal government does that is not mentioned in the Constitution. And that is at the heart of a battle between a group of people led by Alexander Hamilton on the one hand, and another group of people led by Thomas Jefferson on the other hand. And I will get to that in later episodes. But as I said today, I'm just going to deal with the situation that the Washington administration had inherited, what challenges the United States was still facing, despite having authored and created a document that built a much more powerful central government. As usual, I am going to give you all a question to think about as I go through this information that I think will help you to better process what I'm saying. And I'm going to give you the resources that I used to put together this episode. But before I do that, I'd like to ask y'all to please like and subscribe if you have not already done so. As you know, it helps other people find the channel, and that really helps me and helps me to keep giving you the content that I've been creating. So if you're enjoying this and you have not done so already, please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family. So if you're anything like me, you sort of grew up on movies and TV, informing your view of a lot of the world. I've imagined in several instances the way that a movie or a TV series about the creation of the Constitution might end. You might see it as they get together at this constitutional convention, they lay out all the problems, there are these various dramatic scenes of Washington and, Robert Morris arguing with one another about this or that. There's another scene where Governor Morris and James Wilson are butting heads with each other and trying to convince one another of the best path to go forward because there's this other group of people that they both disagree with that they know is going to throw a monkey wrench into the process. And then you smash cut over to the representatives from New York who wanted to submarine the whole thing because they definitely did not count on the creation of a whole new government. And despite all these conflicts and all of this drama, eventually it ends with the creation of the Constitution and everybody sails into the sunset and it's all happy. And it leaves you to think that there were no problems afterward. That is the sort of Hollywood TV movie version of how this might look. And for a long time, as a kid and as an early adolescent, that informed my view of the world. And I grew up with a pretty kind of fucked up view of the way that things work. I remember thinking, because of movies and TV shows that I'd seen when I was a kid, when I was a young teenager, that like racism was solved. You saw these movies about the civil rights movement. There were a couple about the Civil War and the end of slavery and stuff like that. And they all ended with this really rosy picture of what things were like in the aftermath of those events. And you kind of were led to believe that like everything was hunky-dory afterward. You know, it wasn't until I don't know, turned about like 14, 15, and I started listening to hip hop, I realized that no, racism isn't over by a long shot. And I think that in America, at least, the TV movie version of history, of real life, has done a lot to distort our collective view of the way that things look. Perhaps you out there were a lot more wise, were a lot less naive than I was. I was sort of assisted in my rosy view of the world as a young person by the fact that my parents, despite whatever else their other flaws may have been, never uttered, that I can remember, a biased word against any group that I ever heard. They never said anything that could even be sort of construed as racist or homophobic or anti-Semitic or anything like that. And they taught all of us to always respect everybody and treat everybody with dignity and not to judge anybody by anything other than the way that they behaved. So the combination of that with the sort of TV movie version of the world definitely distorted my perspective on some things. And perhaps that was the case with you, perhaps it wasn't. But I'm saying all that to illustrate that if you watch the TV or movie version of the creation of the Constitution, you might be left at the end of it with this notion that Constitution ratified, everything's a-okay, we're all good now. And that just is not the truth of the world and of the way that history has unfolded. Yes, there are these big leaps forward, these big accomplishments undertaken by society. They do make a difference, but it doesn't mean that everything is all fantastic and amazing going forward. All of the problems that I've discussed in the episodes leading up to the ratification of the Constitution and the ones that I talked about how the Constitution was created, all those problems were still there, more or less, once the Constitution was ratified. And it was really just a question of how is this new national government and how is the dynamic between the national government and the states going to help the United States get through a lot of these early struggles. And ultimately, of course, it was pretty effective at a lot of those things. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it was fairly effective because the United States survived despite a lot of headwinds, a lot of challenges. That is what I'm going to get into right now. But as I said, I want to first introduce the resources that I'm using. They have changed a little bit for this series of episodes. I'm going to be using, of course, The American Pageant, a U.S. history textbook. I'm also going to be using information from Give Me Liberty, another widely used AP U.S. history textbook. I'm going to be referring back to now John Adams, the book by David McCullough, which I've used in some previous episodes. I'm also going to be referring back to The Art of Power by John Meacham, which is a biography about Thomas Jefferson. And then the significant new resource that I'm going to be referring to for the next few episodes, for, probably the next couple of months, is the next book, chronologically at least, in the series of books, the Oxford U.S. History series of books. The next book after The Glorious Cause is called Empire of Liberty, and it was written by Gordon S. Wood. Like The Glorious Cause, it does a really phenomenal job, in my view, of introducing a lot of the fundamental challenges that the United States faced from Washington's administration through most of the first term that James Madison served as president. Basically, the book tracks what goes on in America from roughly 1785 to roughly 1815. And these are all really good books. They're very well written. They're long. They're like 700 plus pages, but they do a great job of breaking things down. So that's a new resource that I'm adding. The question that I think it would be good for y'all to think about as I go through all this is, what challenges did the new government under the Constitution face? And how did the evolution of American democracy clash with the governance envisioned by the authors of the Constitution? I'll say that one more time. What challenges did the new government under the Constitution face, and how did the evolution of American democracy clash with the governance envisioned by the authors of the Constitution? So plainly, one of the things I'm going to discuss here is the way in which the authors of the Constitution had one idea about how American governance should work, and a lot of the common average folks throughout the United States had a sort of different idea about how American democracy and the American government should work. So let me go ahead and jump in right now to that conflict. Democracy and its expansion versus the sort of conservative backlash that was the Constitutional Convention and what it did to dramatically alter the nature of the national government once the Constitution was ratified. In the years during and immediately after the Revolution, Americans were demanding and acquiring a lot more democratic rights. And by democratic rights, primarily I am talking about voting, the ability to vote, and the ability to hold elected office. Voting was not something that a lot of people in colonial America did. It didn't expand hugely from the colonial period to the newly independent United States, but it did expand in a way that is worth mentioning. Typically, it is less wealthy white men who get to vote and who get to hold public office in states and in local governments where they wouldn't have had that opportunity during the colonial period. State legislatures and the way that they evolved reflect that, because they had grown. State legislatures had. That is the state governments of Massachusetts, Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland, what have you. They had grown in both the number of members in the state legislature, so there were more representatives in the state legislatures doing governance than had been the case in the colonial period, and in the number of Americans eligible to vote in those elections. More rural men of less education and wealth were elected officials in the new state legislatures than had been the case during the colonial period or even in the Revolutionary period. So as the United States breaks away from the influence of Great Britain, you see a democratizing effect over the states and the nation as a whole. By way of example, in New Hampshire, there had been 34 members of the state legislature, of the colonial legislature, in 1765. And these were almost all men from the coast who had money, and therefore are what we would call members of the elite. But in 1786, the now state legislature of New Hampshire had 88 members, and a lot of these were from more rural districts, more rural areas of the state of New Hampshire, and were men who had less education, less money, and were not what we would consider the traditional elite of late 18th century society. In addition to the greater demand for voting rights and for the ability to hold public office, there was also greater demand for public access to government operations. What do I mean by that? I mean that the public wanted more transparency. They wanted to be able to see the way that these governments operated. They did not want these governments to operate in closed-door rooms that they could not observe for themselves if they wanted, or that didn't have detailed reports coming out of them. One of the examples that you see in various state houses is that the size of the rooms in which the state governments met was expanded so that people could sit in and observe what went on if they chose to. There was also an expansion of newspapers in just about every part of the United States, and that was largely because more reporters were covering what the state governments were doing due to increased demand for that information from the public. So you had a lot more newspapers reporting what is going on in the various state governments to the voting public, which has expanded. And things got pretty, you would say, radical in terms of the demands of the public during the revolutionary and immediate post-revolutionary period. Some Americans even pushed for laws that provided for a more equal distribution of property, because it was feared that too few men were getting control of too much of the land and wealth and property of the United States. None of this ever came to fruition, as far as I know. I don't think there were any equal distribution of property laws passed, but it was definitely something that people talked about and wrote about, and made the case that if they were going to have a successful republic, you couldn't have this small cabal or oligarchy of men controlling most or a significant majority of the wealth and resources of the entire country. That would undermine the whole notion of a republic. So a lot of what is going on here is alarming, to say the least, to a lot of the traditional elites. And I discussed over the course of the time that I went into the way that the Constitution was created and what the decision-making process was and how it came to look what it looked like, that a lot of the men who met at the Constitutional Convention were really concerned about what they saw in the various state houses all over the United States. They thought that things were getting way off the rails and that there was, as they said, kind of ad nauseum over the course of creating the Constitution, ratifying the Constitution, too much democracy. That's something that you saw and heard a lot of in the 1787 to about 1790 period. James Madison in 1787 complained about this, and as the father of the Constitution is illustrative of the general sense of uneasiness that a lot of these elites had in the late 1780s. He said, Madison did, that states passed more laws in 10 years of independence than in the entire colonial period. And from his point of view, and from the point of view of a lot of the traditional elites, that wasn't a good thing. A lot of laws being passed like that meant that bad laws were being passed, that recklessness was creeping into the government from the way that they saw it. He, Madison, said that there was a, quote, lack of wisdom and steadiness, unquote, in state governments, and that this was, quote, the grievance complained of in all of our republics, unquote. And he says republics there to kind of indicate that at this stage, before the Constitution is ratified or even created, that the United States is really kind of a series of republics that are, as I've said before, 13 separate little islands from each other. Madison also said that he questioned, quote, the fundamental principle of Republican government, unquote. Again, I'm quoting him extensively here because he is known as the father of the Constitution, the guy that probably best exemplifies what the interests of those who wanted the new Constitution were at that time. So all of this stuff frightened the upper classes terribly. There was talk about excessive democracy, as I said a moment ago, and this was one of the motivations for the Constitutional Convention and very much a guiding principle for how the Constitution turned out when it was finished. Citizens were demanding things that a lot of the upper classes thought were really bad ideas. Lower taxes. Why is that a bad idea from the upper class point of view? Because paying off the national debt, and the tax money is what's going to do that, is a big concern from the point of view of the upper classes. Because if the government does not pay off its debt, it's going to be real hard for the United States to do business going forward. Not to mention the fact that the United States really doesn't have a lot of money to pay for things like defense. There's also a big push by a lot of the common people, average folks in the various states, to start printing paper money. And why do they want that? Because it will make it easier for them to pay off their own debts and to deal with their own financial difficulties, which I had mentioned in previous episodes how the United States found itself in a lot of economic trouble once the revolution was over. And that weighed pretty heavily on common people. It's one of the reasons that you end up with something like Shays' Rebellion in 1786-87. And there's also this push for more equal distribution of wealth. Bottom line, real big panic point for a lot of these upper classes, the thing that they are fucking terrified of, is this notion that the masses of poorer people are going to come together and, using their democratic voice and their power, they're going to vote and act in democratic ways to take the wealth from the upper classes. It's something that you never really totally see go away in the United States as a concern for people from the wealthier classes. And it's something that you can see any number of examples of founding fathers writing each other about, talking to each other about, as the Constitution's being ratified, as the new government's being implemented. They're freaking out about what these average Americans might do. And the thing they're most freaked out about is that their property is going to get voted away from them, that their wealth is going to get voted away from them by the masses. And it's pretty easy to see, I think, when you take into consideration that point of view, why it was that the Constitution made things so much less democratic. And what do I mean by that? The Electoral College, for example. The Electoral College is a way of having the executive, the president, chosen not by the people, but by these electors. Really, up until about 1824, the Electoral College is not really responsive at all to the voters in the various states. I may be overstating it a little bit there. Like, there were some states that had voters' input determine what the electors in the Electoral College would do. But they're in the minority. And certainly, like when Washington was elected president, the common people had almost no voice in that choice. That was electors to the Electoral College doing their own thing, making their own decisions about who would be president, independent of what voters wanted. And that is how the Electoral College worked for most of the period 1788 to 1824. Another example of this is, of course, the Senate. Senators were not directly chosen by voters until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913. You get that? So one of the major houses of Congress, people had no direct vote on who would represent them in the Senate until 1913. So we have had more time where state legislatures and the people elected to those offices chose who U.S. senators from states were going to be than we have had voters directly choosing who was going to be in the U.S. Senate from their state. And then, of course, there's the judiciary, which is not elected at all. It's appointed by the president with advice and consent from the Senate. So there was a lot less democracy, and it's why I've referred in the past to the Constitution as a conservative triumph. Apart from this clash between the traditional elites who saw a lot of danger in the increasing democracy and the common people who wanted much more of a say in their governments, there's a lot of other challenges facing the United States, as I said, that creating the Constitution on its own did not solve. You had, for instance, the fight over ratifying the Constitution. A lot of people were not happy with the fact that the Constitution had been ratified. There was a whole group of Anti-Federalists who were very opposed to a much stronger central government. We talked about the reasons for that a lot over the last few episodes, so I'm not going to reiterate that here. But let's just say that after the Constitution was ratified, it didn't mean that their concerns and their animosity toward the folks who, in their minds, in a lot of cases, pulled the wool over their eyes by not just altering the Articles of Confederation, but by creating a whole new government, that animosity, that uneasiness did not just go away once the Constitution was ratified. There was a Bill of Rights, and that was something that a lot of people opposed to the Constitution, and even those in favor of it, thought was a good idea. It was put together shortly after the Constitution had been ratified by the requisite number of states to put it into effect. It's mostly, again, James Madison who was behind these 10 amendments. There were more than 10. 10 were actually ratified by the states. The first 10 amendments were ratified slowly and without a whole lot of enthusiasm. There were 3 states, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Georgia, that didn't even bother to ratify the first 10 amendments. And according to what I have read by historians on the subject, Americans were in favor of these new amendments. Their representatives in the state level ratified these new amendments, and then they were kind of just forgotten about for a long time, for at least a couple of generations. Americans did not spend a lot of time thinking about the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. I would say it's probably not until the Civil War era, 1840s, 50s, the era just before the Civil War, that you get many Americans thinking much about the Bill of Rights at all. Apart from getting people to accept the new government as it was implemented, there was the problem of actually implementing it. There were a lot of unanswered questions about how the government would actually work on a day-to-day basis. Because, as I've said, the Constitution is very short. There's not a lot of specifics in there. And all of those that were an early part of the new national government recognized that this was going to be a challenge. There wasn't a lot of certainty about what the relationship between the new national government and the state governments would be. There wasn't a lot of certainty about what the relationship between the different branches of the federal government would be. That all had to be kind of figured out. Madison, again, I'm going to quote him here, says, quote, "Scarcely a day passes without some striking evidence of the delays and perplexities springing merely from the want of precedents," unquote. So in other words, we don't have anything to go on here. We're all just like improvising. Hey, how is the Senate going to actually interact with the president? Fuck if I know, man. We just created this thing. I don't know where it's going to go. As I will get into, that is an example of a problem that caused some significant friction between legislators and the president, George Washington. Westward expansion was a chaotic and disordered development that went on. The British government, we'd already discussed in previous episodes, had trouble regulating this. They passed, for instance, the Proclamation of 1763 to forbid colonists from going west of the Appalachian Mountains. That didn't do shit. People still went west of the Appalachians, and the new federal government under the Constitution didn't have much better luck. And not only was there a concern about these people going west and the conflict that that would raise with Native Americans, but there's also a concern that these people are going to go west and they're just going to be like a whole different thing apart from the United States once they are on the frontier and out of the reach of a lot of the governance of the United States. That they would not think of themselves as Americans any longer. There were no shortage of people, of frontiersmen, who thought of themselves as really kind of their own nation in a way. And that is not something that has entirely gone away in American society now. You know, you got all of these kind of right-wing fringe groups now, militias and so forth, that settle out in the boonies somewhere, usually in the Mountain West, and try to just kind of operate as their own independent, sovereign entity. You see a lot of that in this period. People who want to kind of go out into the frontier, hack their living out of the wilderness, and be like, to hell with all these people. I'm just going to do my own thing. And there's an added concern at this point because some of those people who went west, it was feared, might actually defect to Spain or to Britain or to France. The United States might have former citizens that are now hostile to them because Spain and France and Britain could offer things that this young and kind of impoverished and structurally challenged government couldn't offer. Apart from that, sectionalism was already becoming an issue. And what I mean by sectionalism is this notion that the United States, as a big country, even back then, has inherent conflicts as a result of it being a big and diverse country geographically and demographically. At this stage, you're talking about the interests of the Northeast, the interests of the South, the interests of people in the West, all kind of conflicting with one another in different ways. An illustration of that point is that people in the Western frontier areas, not just of the unincorporated, not yet states of the United States, the territory that is west of the original 13 states, but people in the western parts of the original 13 states, like the western part of Pennsylvania, the western part of Maryland, the western part of Georgia, etc. These are people who want to make sure that their farm goods are going to be able to travel to market. And the most important artery for that is the Mississippi River. On the other hand, you've got people in the Northeast, mostly merchants and bankers and businessmen and so forth, who want to trade with European countries. And the way that that becomes an issue of conflict is that Spain is pushing to have exclusive navigational rights on the Mississippi, which would be bad for people in the West. But people in the Northeast want to trade with Spain. They want to sell their goods to Spain. And so there's this conflict over, do we give Spain the right to control the Mississippi and piss off people in the West, or do we prevent the Spanish from having exclusive rights to the Mississippi, keep that as a navigable waterway for our people out west, and then perhaps not do as much trade with the Spanish because they're pissed off at us for not giving them exclusive navigational rights over the Mississippi. That was an actual issue that reared its head during the Washington administration, slightly before it even. This is not a thing that ever really goes away. It's still an issue now in a lot of ways, and it was definitely an issue at this time. The United States government is just not as well equipped to cope with it as it would be later on. Speaking of Spain, the United States is facing serious territorial challenges from the Spanish in the Southwest. There's disputes between the United States and Spain about who actually possesses which parts of what is today Florida, Alabama, Mississippi. The Spanish are pushing to get what they want, and the United States are pushing to get what was promised to them in the Treaty of Paris. So that's a conflict. The French are not real happy with the United States at this point because the French were sort of muscled out, or not even muscled out, but kind of like circumvented as a part of the negotiation process with Britain over the peace treaty because France wanted to keep the United States small and weak. And obviously, the American negotiators wanted as much territory as they could get, and getting all that territory out to the Mississippi is not something that the French had in mind, and the British and the Americans agreed to that absent any French input, really. And that did not make things copacetic, really, between the United States and France in the 1780s, 90s. So that is a challenge. And then, of course, there's Britain. There were some people in the British government who wanted to establish a friendly, profitable business relationship between Britain and the United States. There were other people who really wanted to punish the United States for breaking away, who were very bitter about the revolution and all that it had cost Great Britain. Those folks who were angry at the United States had a lot of ways to make problems for the United States by inciting Native Americans on the frontier and supplying them with weapons, by occupying forts that the British had said that they would retreat from in the Treaty of Paris, in part because the United States had promised to make whole the Loyalists who had lost a lot during the Revolution, and they never did. The United States government did not really fulfill its promise to make the Loyalists whole. They really lost out, and that was a source of bitterness and conflict between the two sides. And then, of course, the British still have the world's best navy and still have dominance over the Atlantic Ocean, which could and did create a lot of problems for American merchantmen. And then, of course, there's the Native Americans themselves who, in many cases, fought against the United States on the side of Britain during the Revolution because they recognized correctly, as it turned out, that an independent United States would be the worst thing that could happen to them, because it would mean more settlers from the United States, more European-descended settlers, would go west and try to take their territory from them, which, of course, is exactly what happened. Finally, but not least of all, there is working out the particulars of state and federal authority and cooperation. That looked like an absolute bitch, because nobody knew how all this is supposed to work. As Madison discussed when it came to the way that the federal government itself would operate, there's just a real lack of precedent here. And the states are going to push for as much authority and as much control and as much power as they can get, and the federal government is going to try to push for its own authority. Where do these lines end and begin? That's something that needs to be sorted out, and it's against the backdrop of all of these other problems that we're talking about. So the United States was not short of problems to deal with as the Washington administration came into power. So that's it for today. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to get into more of the specifics of what the Washington administration did, what the first Congress did, and so forth. Thank you as always for listening. Again, please like and subscribe. If you have any thoughts, any input, any suggestions, You can reach out to me at howthehelldiwegetherepod@gmail.com, or you can leave me a voicemail or a text message at area code 951-525-5536. Thanks again, take care, and I will catch y'all